Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm very sorry I have to wear a mask today, but according to the CDC, I should. My daughter tested positive for COVID on Saturday. She's totally fine. Symptoms lasted only a couple of days. But since we live in this weird transition where we still, take special precautions, I'm going to keep my mask on. I apologize because it muffles my speech, but I hope we can nonetheless have a very successful moderation. I want to thank you, all of you, for being here. It's really a pleasure for me to introduce the two speakers today. In this occasion, that it's both very nice that we are convening to remember, but at the same time is the remembrance of a very tragic and sad event in the history of Latin America, one that will be repeated in the years following in many other countries of the region. So certainly, we commemorate what was really a very sad, a tragic event in the history of our countries, but also we do so from the present, seeking to learn from that and trying to avoid the same mistakes. Something that sometimes it seems our polities can't quite do. Arturo Valenzuela, I'll introduce him first, is Emeritus Professor of Government and Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and he formerly directed the Latin American Studies program and was the founding director of the Center for Latin American Studies in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Policy at Georgetown University. Prior to joining the Georgetown faculty in 1987, he was professor of political science and director of the Council of Latin American Studies at Duke University. He has been a visiting scholar at Oxford University, the University of Sussex, the University of Florence, the University of Chile, and the Catholic University of Chile, and a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Centers for Scholars. He's a specialist on the origins and consolidation of democracy, Latin American politics, electoral systems, civil-military relations, political parties, regime transitions, and U.S.-Latin American relations. Dr. Valenzuela is an expert on the politics of the Southern Cone, as well as Mexican politics. He's the author or co-author of 9 books, including one of my favorite books of all times, Political Brokers in Chile, and also The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes, a collection of books that was edited by Guillermo O'Donnell and Peter Schmitter, and in which collection Arturo wrote the volume on Chile. His work has appeared in many edited collections, such as this one, as well as top scholarly journals. Dr. Valenzuela was also appointed by President Barack Obama as the Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere Affairs in the United States Department of State, a position he held until August 2011, when he returned to Georgetown. In the post of Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere, he was responsible for the formulation and execution of United States policy towards the Western Hemisphere, from Canada to Argentina and Chile. In President Clinton's first term, Arturo served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Hemispheric Affairs, with primary responsibility for the implementation of U.S. foreign policy toward Mexico. He has also received numerous accolades for his diplomatic contributions. It's really a pleasure to have you here, Arturo. Thank you so much for fitting us in your schedule. Next, I'm going to present Professor Peter Ciavelis, who works in the Department of Political Science and International Affairs and is director of the Chile-Argentina Study Abroad program. And sorry, I don't have your university here. Wake Forest, that's right. I didn't want to get it wrong. Sorry about that. He received his PhD from Georgetown University and has held visiting appointments in Chile and Spain. He has published on Latin America electoral and legislative politics in numerous journal articles and book chapters, including publications in comparative politics, comparative political studies, among many other very prestigious political science journals. He's the author of The President and Congress in Post-Authoritarian Chile, Institutional Constraints to Democratic Consolidation, which was published in the year 2000. And more recently, of co-editor of Pathways to Power, Political Recruitment and Candidate Selection in Latin America, which he co-edited with Scott Morgensen. He also just told me that he has a very fresh out of press book here about which I think we'll hear during his remarks. It's really for me a pleasure to then introduce the two speakers. And before I pass the word to them, I want to acknowledge the work of my colleague Anne-Françoise Albiar, who made possible the organization of this panel, as well as a pairing panel or sister panel, if you wish, that will take place on the 19th of September at noon, and that will bring 3 historians to also look at the 50 years since the coup d'etat in Chile. So please mark your calendars for that event as well, coming up on the 19th. And last but not least, I think Kathy Bartsch would scold me if I didn't tell you that on September 15th at noon, we are having one of our new postdocs, Maria Laura Pensa, who I saw around there, present her work in progress, or rather her dissertation work, Tierra de los Indios Enemigos, an exploration of the insurgent Chaco through its cartography. And this is just one of many other very exciting events we have this month, so please check our website for more events. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Arturo and Peter. What we'll do is we'll give each speaker about 10 to 15 minutes for introductory remarks, and then we'll open up to questions. Thank you.
Hello, hello. It's working? Great, thanks so much. Well, look, I'm really honored and pleased to be able to be here at the University of Pennsylvania, even though what we're remembering today really is one of the tragic events really of recent times, which was the 9/11, 1973 coup d'etat in Chile. They brought down one of the oldest democracies in Latin America, and that had significant repercussions worldwide, including with regard to U.S.-Latin American relations, U.S.-Chilean relationships, and its impact in other places in the world at the same time. Again, I'm pleased to be here with you for this dialogue and conversation. I had graduated from Columbia University in getting my doctorate. I hadn't really quite finished the dissertation when I was hired by Duke University. So in 1970, I went to Duke University, and that's the year that Allende was actually elected president. And when I was at Duke in 1972, a former professor of mine at Columbia gave me a call, and he said, Arturo, with his extraordinary German accent on his Spanish, because he had grown up as a German-Spanish citizen who did his doctoral work at Columbia University, where even some of the most outstanding scholars at Duke at Columbia University at the time would bring their graduate students to listen to Juan Linz give his accounts in comparative politics. Daniel Bell would show up, Robert Merton would show up, and so on with some of their students. And Juan, of course, would pace back and forth and be extremely eloquent. This is a young assistant. He was finishing up his PhD himself, assistant professor. But at any rate, to move forward, since I really promised that I would only be 15 minutes, and that's hard for somebody who's a professor who's, if you switch the switch on, you just go for 45 minutes without stopping, and I'll try to not do that. But here I am at Columbia, at Duke University at the time, left Columbia in 1972, and Juan calls me, and he says, we need to have you help us out with something, because Al Steppen, who had been a colleague of mine as a graduate student at Columbia, and I are doing a project on the breakdown of democratic regimes in Europe and Latin America. In Europe and Latin America. And we think this is important. We need to figure out what's going on with those sorts of things. Would you help us out? And I said, well, I'd be happy to do that. Well, because Chile had one of the longest histories of relatively well-consolidated democratic institutions, it'd be perfect to have Chile represented in this as well. This is 1972, he calls me. And I said, fine. So that means you want me to write something on the breakdown of democracy in Chile in 1924, correct? He said, yes. So that's what I started to do. I started doing research on the breakdown of democracy in Chile in 1924. And was told at the time that you would have to present your initial findings on the breakdown of democracy in 1924 at the conference to be held at Yale University, where both Juan Lintz and Al Steppen had moved from Columbia at that time, which was to be held in December of 1973. So I was working very hard on this 1924 breakdown, trips to Chile. It was valuable for me because I would go to the Senate and to the Congress, and this is, the Allende government was already in place. And so I had some idea of what was going on there, and I followed that somewhat closely. But then, of course, as I said earlier, he asked me to write something on the 1973 breakdown. You might ask yourself, and I don't want to go on too much, why the Latin American cases with the European cases? For a very simple reason. The Latin American cases are of the oldest republics, sovereign states, nation states, not state nations, in the parlance, in the world. They go way, way back. They go way, way back because of the failure of the French Revolution. Égalité, liberté, fraternité did not work out. Napoleon came instead. He overthrew the King of Spain. And what we had then was, revolutions in Latin America that follow what precedent? Not the French Revolution, but the Philadelphia Constitution. And so the ideals of the Ilustración, of the Enlightenment, then, mark the beginning of the countries in Latin America. And I'll finish this because I'm now halfway through and I haven't gotten to the main point. And that is that take a look at, after World War II ended, two really major conferences. The first one, Bretton Woods, and that's in Vermont, if you don't know. What was set up in Vermont? Well, as Dean Acheson, the former Secretary of State for President Truman said, in his book, as President of the Creation then and Bretton Woods was the architecture of the world system economically. That's where the International Monetary Fund was approved. That's where the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade, was approved. That's where the World Bank was approved. And how many signatories were there? Well, I can just tell you 40% of those signatures were Latin American republics, 40%. And what happened in San Francisco the year later? I'm talking about that was April 1944. What happened in July of 1945? Where else was there a big conference? San Francisco. And what was founded in San Francisco? United Nations. And the United Nations in San Francisco was founded, and how many of the signatories were Latin American? 42%. 42%. Because the rest of the countries were still parts of the huge empires. But anyway, okay, so I'm going to stop, with this. This is why they wanted to do the Latin American states. It's because, and it's an important item to mention as well, because even today, when we see the catastrophes of the current 21st centuries and the huge mistake of Fukuyama and others, we tend to not realize that many other parts of the world, are what you'd have to call state nations, where states were implemented not really on territories that had a common sense of identity, which is something different also in Latin America. When Subcomandante Marcos rises in Mexico on the 1st of January, 1974, the day I took over responsibilities for the US government on the Mexican relations, it wasn't to call for a Maya republic. It was called just simply to get, the Mexican government to respond to the demands of the people then. All right, so let's go back then to 1973. What happens in 1973? In 1973, we have an election, that is, a government that's terminated brutally in one of the worst times. It was elected in 1970. Allende got 36.2% of the vote. Alessandri got 34.9% of the vote. So Allende, the Marxist, gets 36.2. Alessandri, the conservative, gets 34.9%. And Tomic, who was a Christian Democrat, gets 27.8%. Boy, this is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, right? And in fact, Allende gets less of the vote than he did in 1964 when former President Frey won. In the previous election, he got 38.9% then. So he's a little bit lower than that. Now, in Chile at the time, and this is very important, if nobody got a majority, the Congress would have to select. And so that meant that the vote went to the Congress. And who is elected? Allende is elected because the Christian Democrats then, at that time, the leadership of the Christian Democrats was the leftist leadership. And the leftist leadership, and Tomic, the candidate of the Christian Democrats, was part of the leftist sector, and they support Allende then. Allende, the right and others push back on this. They adopt what was it? The guarantees, some kind of a resolution on guarantees of democratic performance, which the Allende coalition agrees to, and so Allende becomes president. All right, and the key, if I might cite a book. Should I cite a book? The early failures of the popular unity government and the eventual breakdown of Chilean democracy cannot be explained by accusing one side or the other of destroying the system. It was not merely the result of erroneous economic policies or a deliberate strategy on the part of elements in the government to accelerate the collapse of bourgeois institutions, nor was it simply the result of reactionary forces aided and abetted from abroad, i.e. the US, in the government, to accelerate the collapse of abroad, who sought to preserve privilege at all costs. Certainly these elements were present in varying degrees, but the breakdown democracy must be understood in broader terms. It must be understood as a failure to structure a viable center tendency in a highly polarized society with strong centrifugal tendencies. Key sectors in both the government and the opposition were committed to the possibility of change within the context of ongoing institutions. And this is what happens, you've got this. Now, there are quite a few people in the Allende coalition that wanted to push forward to radicalize this situation. And you had quite a few people, including in the United States. Why was the US so worried about Chile in 1970 when Allende was elected? It had nothing to do really with Chile. The famous phrase was Henry Kissinger's, who said, The United States cannot stand idly by and allow a government to go Marxist because of the irresponsibility of its people. Do you think Henry Kissinger was really worried about Chile? Give me a break. He was worried about the precedent that could come out of having a Marxist government elected through a constitutional process that was legitimate. And he was concerned not about Chile at all, but about Italy and France at the time. So that's the origins of that issue. Twice during the Allende government, the attempts were made to try to keep that center going. Once in about 1972, it was the far left where they're trying to push too far on some of the reforms, la política de hechos consumados, fait accompli, which is both English and French, I guess. That's how they were trying to push change. And on the other hand, of course, you had sectors on the right that did not want to do that. And the Christian Democrats were ambivalent because they were divided between the right, center, and left of the Christian Democrats. What they call themselves is los guatones, los terceristas, who were in the middle, y los rebeldes. So you had fractions on the Christian Democrats. The first attempt to get a resolution 72 fails. And then congressional elections coming up, some of the people on the right of the Christian Democratic Party were beginning to worry that they were losing much too much ground to the right, and that they might not do so well in the congressional elections. So you had sort of party concerns, electoral concerns, but also ideological concerns that were in play. I'll finish with this. Why did things crumble at the end? Well, the Christian Democrats elected a new leadership. That leadership really did not want to continue to support the government at the time. They weren't necessarily plotting for a coup. They weren't, but they were not. They wanted to come up with. And so Allende was willing, however, to bargain with them. He was. I'm convinced of that. In that period that I was in Chile from January of 1974 until the end of 1974, pretty much that whole period, I interviewed all these critical figures. One of them was Briones, who was the Minister of the Interior of Allende. They were working and trying to get a plebiscite out. Allende was willing to submit himself to a plebiscite. And if he lost the plebiscite, he would go. But even more importantly, at another juncture, even earlier, there were some fairly radical people in the cabinet, and Allende decided he would send a message to the Archbishop, who was helping with a negotiation with the Cardinal, who was helping with the negotiations as well, to the Christian Democrats, by appointing high-ranking military officers to the cabinet. So he took out of the cabinet some of the, and the military, had fairly good, prestige in the country. So this was Allende's effort to say, look, I'm willing to sort of try to moderate my own side right here, and I'm going to put these people in. The problem was that the right wing of the Christian Democratic Party did not buy it. And one of the most difficult things, I'll end with this, one of the most difficult things for a young professor at Duke University was when the first draft of Breakdown of Democracy in Chile appeared. Where did it appear? It appeared in La Revista Italiana di Ciencia Politica, because Giovanni Sartori, the great Italian scholar, really wanted, and was close to Juan Linz, wanted to publish, the first, draft, because, this is really important. And so he published it. And I had promised one of the other interviewees that I had in Chile that I would send him the first draft. And that person was former President Eduardo Frei Montalva, the president of Chile from 1964 until 1970, right before, and who I interviewed twice. He was the president of the Senate at the time. He'd been president. He was on the right of the Christian Democratic Party. And I interviewed him twice, once at his home, and the other time at the little tiny house that I had rented in Santiago, where I hadn't finished the interview with him. So he said, look, we can follow up. I said, well, you had me over to your place. Why don't I have you over to mine? So I actually made arrangements to get a cook to come to make some food. This was under the state of siege, estado de sitio, That evening was the only time that I thought I was really going to lose my life, because a tank came after me, because I had to take the cook back to her house after Fray Montalva left, But when he left, in this right in the little front of this little house, he put his hand on my shoulder here and he said, I hope you will tell the truth about Chile in your work. And I said, I promise you, I will send you the first version of this. And the first version that I sent them was Rivista Italiana di Ciencia Politica's little abstract. And the journal was actually run by that time by Gianfranco Pasquino, a very important Italian political leader. And it was translated by a very important, he did not like it. This is where I end. The worst letter I ever received in my life was an 8-page long letter. I have copies in my briefcase right here from Eduardo Frei Montalva, accusing me of being part of the communist conspiracy in the world against Chile. I wrote him an 8-page response, and I never got an answer from that. But I was on leave at the University of Sussex in 1975-76, and suddenly I was told that Fray Montalva was coming through, and would I come to a reception that they were doing for him? I said, I better not go to the reception because he doesn't like me very much. And but the host said, well, come on, don't be ridiculous. Why don't you come to the reception? I walk in, I hand my hand over, and he looks at me and he says, no way, I'm not going to shake your hand. He turns around and walks out. So, at any rate, in 1980, his son-in-law, the husband of Carmen Frey, a distinguished senator who's still in politics in Chile, happened to see me when I was in Chile on another issue. And he says, my father-in-law, he was a very prominent political leader himself, Eugenio Ortega, my father-in-law wants to see you. He recognizes that, you're a fairly distinguished scholar. And given the fact that, you haven't been in touch in a while, would you mind going to see him this evening? I said, I have my flight back to Washington this evening, but I promise I'll come. I'd love to be able to talk to him. And I left back to Washington. And just a few months later, he died. It's still not clear whether he was killed or not. I will end on that somber note. Thank you.
This is live. Yeah, thank you, Arturo, and thank you for setting a somber tone for what's a somber event. Just wanted to thank Tulia Faletti, Kathy Barch for the invitation to join you today, and also Amanda Wessel for her help with the logistics and actually getting me here to Philadelphia. Also the Center for Latin American Latinx Studies and Perry Wildhaus for hosting the event. It's also an honor to share the stage with my colleague, mentor, and friend, Arturo Valenzuela. He was my dissertation mentor, my intellectual father. So it's an honor always to be here with him. Arturo covered some of the causes and consequences of the 1973 military coup. What I would like to focus on a little more, where my work has been on what are the lessons are for us today, for democracies today, for Chile today. As we all know, 50 years ago today, Air Force planes strafed the La Moneda presidential palace. Salvador Allende made an inspirational final speech and then took his own life. The coup was particularly tragic because Chile was really an island of democratic peace in a region that's way too often characterized by right-wing military coups. And as we know, it brought an end to one of the longest standing democracies in Latin America and the brutal dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet that killed over 2,300 people, tortured more than 30,000, and sent tens of thousands into exile. And I think those are the people that we have to remember today. It's also important to note that this cut to the heart of the Chilean nation and the Chilean soul, because Chileans were proud of their democracy. They were proud of being los ingleses de América Latina, right? Of having this long and sustained democracy, and felt like they had somehow fallen into some sort of banana republic status. So it was sort of humiliating for them to have to live through this. 50 years on, we find Chile at a crossroads, a very interesting crossroads. And I wish I could say I could be optimistic, but I'm not. And I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. We had recently the release of some previous classified CIA documents. I think that told us very little. We had the dramatic social upheaval of the estallido in 2019. And then we have the current constitutional rebooting process that at once was hopeful, now seems destined for failure. And the 1980 Chilean dictatorship constitution will likely remain in effect in Chile. So 50 years on, as we think about Chile and we reflect about Chile from the outside, Chile's heralded for its economic success in the region. In political terms and economic terms, through the 90s, the democratic transition was held up as a model democratic transition in the region. Today, if we look at rankings of transparency, Chile and Uruguay are the only two countries rated by Freedom House as full democracies. Also, Chile is among the cleanest countries in Latin America, regularly scoring in Transparency International about where the United States is, but I'm convinced that the United States is much more corrupt. There's just more legalized corruption. Also, this is by far, Chile is by far one of the most successful economies in Latin America, and post-transitional governments made remarkable progress in eliminating extreme poverty, diversifying export markets, and providing widespread access to higher education for Chileans. Most Latin American countries would kill to be able to say what I just said about Chile, but Chileans are not happy, and they're not happy today. The dictatorship left one of the least equal societies in the world, and healthcare, education, and pension systems regularly fail Chileans in their ability to provide themselves a dignified existence. There was a massive social uprising in 2019 that was necessary but heartbreaking when one went through central Santiago and saw the damage. Public opinion surveys show universal rejection of Chilean political institutions and Chilean politicians. The near victory of far-right Pinochet admirer Jose Antonio Cast in 2021 also suggests that Chile is not immune to the kind of right-wing populism that we see emerging in the rest of the world. And as a longtime student of Chilean politics, I thought it would be, but it's not. Finally, the hopeful opportunity that the 2019 uprising provided for a constitutional reboot in Chile is going to go nowhere. So despite success 50 years on, there's still a sense of democratic precariousness in Chile that we need to think seriously about and learn from. But as political scientists, how do we fit what's happening in Chile into our understanding of trying to parse out, trying to figure out what the current political moment means for Chile? I'm going to structure my discussion to try and capture the current political moment around two themes. The first is ideology, and I'll explain why in just a second. And the second is a contrast between the 50th anniversary that we're living today and the 30th anniversary, and how Chile, in my view, is fundamentally a different country than it was 20 years ago. In Arturo's work, he often focused on the importance of ideology in Chile, both in terms of Chile being one of the most ideological societies in the world, but also how local political brokers were able to work with Congress to stem some of that ideological polarization. But another importance of ideology was the ever presence of ideology in Chilean society. Chilean society was among the most ideological, with the highest percentage of Chileans identifying with a particular left, right, or center scale. Chileans were super strong in their ideological commitments to such an extent that it shaped almost every aspect of their lives, as Arturo's work has shown. Where do we stand with respect to ideology in Chile today? Well, it's really entertaining to watch the press and academics talk about ideology. The current conventional wisdom is that Chileans have shifted to the right with the victory of this right-wing constitutional commission and sort of the message that Chileans supposedly send. But it's interesting because following the overwhelming victory of the citizen-based Constituent Assembly in 2020, Chileans were proclaimed to be leftists. They were on the left. They've elected this leftist Constituent Assembly. The presidential primary elections of July 2021 brought forth the two most moderate candidates in each coalition. So the press said, Chileans are moderate, right? So in less than 9 months, they went from being leftist to being moderate. Then in the presidential elections, the far-right candidate, Jose Antonio Cast, wins the election in the first round. Chileans are rightists. They're on the right. I mean, you can read all of this, right? Then Gabriel Boric sails to power, and once again, Chileans are leftists. Then with the defeat of the proposed constitution from the first Constituent Assembly in the election of the 7th, once again, Chileans are on the right. So where are Chileans? I think what we need to do is rethink, because we're political scientists, so we try and think in these terms, but maybe we need to rethink the way we think of ideology. So in a study I did, when Chileans were asked the reasons for poverty, overwhelmingly, Chileans cited individual variables. The most cited variable in explaining poverty in Chile was flojera, laziness. We're just lazy. We Chileans are lazy. Followed by alcoholism and drug addiction. State had nothing to do with poverty. It was all because of us. So one would think that these hijos de Pinochet y hijas de Pinochet have accepted that individual responsibility is what drives the reasons, what drives the reasons for poverty and the status of particular people in society. But then if you go on to ask Chileans about their preferences for how healthcare, education, and retirement should be handled, as well as who should own the banks and the pharmacies, they say they prefer the state to handle it by large margins. Oh, so Chileans are statists. They're not individualists. They didn't swallow the message of Pinochet. My point is that as political scientists, we are going down the wrong road when we're talking about ideology in Chile. Ideology, for me, is not the explanatory variable that we need to be looking at. Ideology no longer remains the best way to understand and interpret differences among Chileans. I think as political scientists, we try and force these ideas into a particular box. What I see in all these elections is a politics of rejection. Chileans consistently reject whatever is put in front of them. A rejection of the status quo, a rejection of the duopoly of the Concertación Chile Vamos situation, a rejection of what exists. They don't care whether the state provides the pension or the pensions are private. They care that the pensions don't work. They don't care if the state's behind healthcare or if individuals are. They care about getting some decent healthcare, right? They don't care whether we call the education system private or public. They care whether they're getting a decent education for a decent price and not paying the most for education of any OECD country in real terms. So in that sense, I think we need to think about, and I'll come back to the constitutional process again. Again, not constitutional reforms aimed at fixing healthcare, education, or Social Security and retirement, but a constitution that provides a framework, incorporating many of the ideas that Arturo has extolled about how you provide a framework for reaching consensus, how you provide a framework for passing policies because constitutions are not a piñata. There's not something for everybody. The constitutions are the framework in which we make policy. Okay, the second point I wanted to make is underscoring the differences in the political moment 30 years during the 30th anniversary and 50 years later. I was in Chile shortly after the 1988 plebiscite, did most of my dissertation work in the 1990, 1991, a very exciting time to be in Chile, but a very scary time to be in Chile. It was exciting because the sense of optimism was palpable. La alegría ya viene, y la alegría llegó, supuestamente, but we see that passage of the years that this has not necessarily been the case. It was scary in the sense that there was two mobilizations, military mobilizations during this time, el Boinazo y el Ejercicio de Enlace, that took place during the years that I was there. But still, with the passage of time, there was this confidence, this optimism. Chile was going to be successful. This was going to be a successful, this model for transition was going to parlay into a successful model for governments. Fast forward 30 years. All the talk at the 30th year anniversary was, look at this wonderful transition we have. We as elites have learned the lessons of the military breakdown. I went to Chile to do my dissertation research with the idea that I was testing Arturo's ideas about how bad presidentialism was. Well, every time I got into an interview, the people in the ministries, the people in Congress said, you know, actually presidentialism is working pretty well. We kind of like it, right? Which put me in an uncomfortable position, right? I'm going off to prove his theory, which is wrong, right? But it's ultimately going to prove right. That's the point that we can get at in the discussion. But you know what the reason was? Consistently, elites said, we remember 1973. We know what happened. We are not going to let that happen again, despite all the disincentives embedded in this institutional structure that we're facing, where Arturo was right, which we're seeing again right now. So at 30 years, there was consensus mechanisms, there was pathways for negotiation and negotiated reform. Chilean politics was decidedly centrist. There was no more maximalist positions of the scary type we're seeing like today on Twitter even, right? An appreciation for the high quality of Chilean democracy. Consistently, this is a high quality democracy. We're proud of it. This is something people should emulate. All right, right now, the situation couldn't be more different. Maximalist political rhetoric has returned. Violence has returned. Social media this morning is replete with revisionism about the coup, that it saved Chile, that these human rights abuses didn't occur. Dangerous, dangerous rhetoric is back. Disdain for the political center. If you're in the center in Chile, you have no business being in politics. Arturo's extensively analyzed the importance of the center. Call me conservative, but a center can broach these sorts of differences. There's few mechanisms for consensus building in Chile today. There's polarization and a very low appreciation for Chilean democracy and all of its institutions, the lowest in Latin America. The lessons that have not been learned, and I'll finish up here, just four. Or lessons that have been forgotten. I think lessons that were learned at 30 years that are being forgotten today. There's a growing tendency to take democracy for granted in Chile, just like existed in the 1970s, right? Oh, this is Chile, we have a strong democracy, the military will never intervene. But we see this in the use of violence, the decline in support for democracy, and also La Generación Sin Miedo, who's coming into politics right now, who've never experienced life under the dictatorship and might take democracy for granted. So it's crucial to understand the fragility of democracy and the challenge of maintaining it. Second, the use of non-democratic means and violent means to achieve objectives have returned on the left and on the right, and extreme anti-democratic rhetoric on the right that's mimicking right-wing populism around the world, with actual denials of documented human rights abuses, which is shocking. So Chileans need to remember and reaffirm the commitment to valuing and promoting the popular will expressed in elections. In the past, and increasingly in the present, there's a complete disdain for the center. disregard for pragmatic centrist views, disregard for mechanisms to build consensus, and a lack of a desire for a centrist consensus. And finally, as the process of writing the Constitution unfolds, unfortunately, this may not even be an issue anymore, because I think we're going to end up right with the 1980 Constitution. The importance of taking some of the institutional lessons of the 1973 failure into account. And I don't see this in the debate. I see particular parties debating institutions with relation to their own particular interests and not with regard to the incentive structures that are embedded in institutions that could make Chilean democracy work or not, and get to the needed reforms to challenge the staggering inequality and the injustice embedded in the Chilean economic system. Democracy, we need to remember today on the 50th anniversary, is not invincible anywhere in Chile, here, anywhere. If anything, the 50th anniversary of Chile's military coup provides a moment for us to reflect on this fragility of democracy in Chile and around the world, and the need to defend it in Chile and the need to defend it right here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to both of you for your presentations. I'm going to kick off our last 10 minutes with a question, and then open it up to the audience for questions as well. In the recent past, the government of Boric has announced that they will investigate the disappearances that took place during the dictatorship. In your opinion, particularly going back to these, the features of the present, where we find ourselves again in a political climate that is highly polarized, with the characteristics that Peter just described. Do you think that investigating what happened to bring justice could help revalue democracy and be more conscientious about some of the costs of its breakdown?
Well, look, that process is taking place, and I think that if there's something that should be underscored, is how critically important the politics of memory and human rights have been in Chile for a long period of time. I had to give several speeches, I think 12, when I was in Chile last month, and one of them was focused on human rights and that kind of thing, and the Museum of Memory. And so, yes, this is an important issue. I think that unlike many other places, there aren't that many situations where we don't know what happened. In fact, quite a few of them. Some have not come to a judicial resolution. And the most recent case of that, of course, was a case of some people who were murdered, who were working, in fact, in the Vicaría de la Solidaridad, which was the Vicariate of Solidarity. That was one of the institutions on human rights. And they actually indicted several military officers. And when they went they're all elderly gentlemen right now, but when they went to pick one of them up, he committed suicide, because he sort of, I guess it was a recognition of that this had happened. I think that unlike the experience in other countries, in Chile, there's been far more effort to address that kind of issue with the strength really of the human rights efforts were really quite significant. And by the way, this is also in the last few weeks or so, Jimmy Carter has come to the attention of people across the world, because it was the Carter administration that really pushed for a significant shift in the policy of the United States towards Chile. And organizations that were set up in the United States actually contributed in a very significant way to that as well. So I think that we need to recognize that the Washington Office of Latin America that was headed up by a colleague and friend in Washington was responsible for the first cutoff of military aid to Chile. If anybody's interested, I could also send you an op-ed that a young professor at Duke University wrote, blasting a senator from North Carolina for having gone down to Chile with a sword in his hand to praise Pinochet and to criticize the American ambassador, who at that particular point in the second Reagan administration was strongly supportive of a transition of government, and the no campaign that allowed Pinochet, that permitted Pinochet to leave office, because that's what was the critical point. And so there was a really significant movement in that regard. If I might take another 2 minutes, let me just simply say one thing about. I also wrote a book with Juan Lintz over here on the perils of presidentialism. So I'm still very, very keen on the concerns that presidentialism have, and many of the people who, in fact, contributed to the book that Peter has just co-edited. Were people who were also convinced that maybe if Chile had been a parliamentary form of government, that wouldn't have happened. And I'm to this day still quite convinced of that. 40% of all parliamentary forms of government in Western Europe since World War II were minority governments. And why did they survive? Why did they survive? Minority governments, they survived because the opposition was divided and not necessarily able to come up with a response to a constructive vote of no confidence. And since they weren't able to come up with a constructive vote of no confidence, then they would continue to, of course, support a minority government's continuation in office. Also, the opposition parties are not united among themselves if it's a multi-party system. And so therefore, many of these legislators don't want to go to a re-election and so on. But then, so I testified before the Constitutional Convention in Chile, and I also have a formula, I think, that ought to be possible. The rules of the game are really important. The rules of the game are absolutely important. And my form is it one of the worst things that the Latin America has done is to adopt the French ballotage, that it's a second round in these elections. And the second round makes some sense because you don't want to have a president elected to office when she's only received, 36% of the vote. Peña Nieto in Mexico got 38% and he became. There is no second round. But the second round, and this is what I've been trying to convince people, should be in the parliament like it was in Chile before. It should be in the parliament, but with a big difference. You don't just sort of throw it into the parliament, hoping that something's going to come out. The first to receive votes, that was the person that got, like in the Chilean case, 36% is what Allende got, and then 34%. The first to get the highest plurality has a week to come up with a program and to appoint a cabinet. And if that first candidate cannot do that, then it goes to the second candidate. And the second candidate then has a week to be able to come up with a program. And so what you're doing with that kind of a process is to encourage the formation of coalitions of governance among more moderate folks that can work with center agreements. And that is something that is clearly possible. And what Chile needs now is that kind of thing. How do we encourage that the rules of the game make it possible, in fact, to come up with, mechanisms? And of course, what I'm saying now is really very relevant for the United States too, but we're not going to go off down that particular road, right? We really have to have a system that is able to come up with, as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in his famous book said, the vital center. It's the vital center, folks. The most societies, and here I might disagree with some of the public opinion surveys that Peter mentioned, in most societies, people don't divide on a you basis. It's not a you basis. In other words, a high right and a high left, or the other way around if you're looking at me. And what you have is, in fact, most societies divide on a bell shape, where the right and the left are fairly small, and the center is either people who don't participate, who are not necessarily knowledgeable, but probably are much more willing to go for a centrist kind of option too. So let's bear that in mind. I think that's a very important thing. And this applies not only to Chile, but to other places in the world as well. So the rules of the game are critical. You've got to get the rules of the game right. If you get the rules of the game right, it's not just about the Constitution and the fundamental rights. It's also about the policies that are developed by the legislature and by the public in order to benefit everybody, so that government of the people and by the people and for the people can function.
Peter, would you like to comment on the possible political effects of identifying missing bodies?
Sure, I'll do it briefly because I know you want to ask some questions. No, just I think that timing is crucial with these things, because I just remember very clearly after President Edwin had finished his term of like 4 or 5 years later, I interviewed him at his home and we talked extensively about this, and he was very frustrated because he said, everybody's like, why didn't you do more? Why didn't you do more? He said, I didn't do more because from my window in La Moneda, I could look at the Ministry of Defense and see Pinochet waving out the window at me, right? I couldn't do anything because literally Chilean democracy would have come to an end. But that excuse ended. It's no longer a valid excuse. I think that moving ahead could be potentially divisive, but as Arturo said, most of these people are dying off. But I think the Redding Commission established the truth of what happened, and I think they should move ahead with cases, because no longer is Chile the sort of sensitive political system where that could be dangerous.
I'm going to ask the audience if you have any questions, and if you could address them as for either one or the other speaker or both. Yes. Would you mind? Yeah, sorry, I should have pointed that out at the beginning. Thank you.
Yeah, so my question is, what are the current foreign policy choices that the American government can make that would affect the situation in Chile today?
Arturo's a diplomat.
Well, look, it's just absolutely no question that the subject of our discussion today is a critical issue across the world, and what the United States needs to do, and it needs to do it not on its own, but working with other countries and other partners to support, democratic institutions. I mentioned earlier that one of the real problems of the world today is not what Latin America faces, but in most of the 193 countries at the UN today, the great majority of those are actually state nations, where you had imperial powers trying to create a jurisdiction with a whole host of different kinds of identities. And that's what we have. So we have Shiites versus Sunni Muslims. We have histories of difficulties. And if you look at Ethiopia, if you look at Nigeria, if you look at all those other places, those are very difficult sorts of things. Or what about what's happening in the Ukraine today? In other words, this is a time when I think that there is a tremendous importance on the part of people all across the world today to try to support democratic institutions. And that's what the policy of the United States should be. But preferably, of course, not working unilaterally, but working with other efforts. And so that's what, it's not easy in this difficult world that we have in the 21st century. Fukuyama really was wrong about the, advent of a liberal order with the end of the Cold War. But that should be our commitment everywhere. And the rules of the game, I hate to go back to that, but that's where your political scientist comes in and displaces the diplomat in my life, not me. And you need to have really sort of good institutions.
Have time for one more question, then we're going to wrap up. There is lunch in the next room, and we can take the conversation informally there. And
I respect that we've heard a lot about the importance of the center and about the importance of the political game, but I really want to press a bit for an answer to the question about violence. How can young people believe that the center could have prevented the violence if the violence emanated not from the center? So I really want to push a little bit to ask you to address that factor, the violence and the brutality after the golpe. Real quick also, if you could comment on 1924, what did you learn with the comparison? Thank you.
Well, look, the violence and the brutality was just unmentionable. It's just unconscionable. I can't tell you how many people, friends of mine and others, suffered, and how despite so many efforts, we weren't able to get people out and so on. I was deeply involved in much of that effort myself, and including. At the same time, as a college student, very much involved in the civil rights movement in the United States, because, my parents put me and my brother on a plane when I was 16 and he was 15 after the earthquake of 1960 destroyed our school. And so that my whole life really has been, in the United States and not in Chile. But I think that there is clearly something there of significant importance in that regard. But I'll let Peter comment on this as well.
Appreciate the question very much, and I understand where it emanates from. Undoubtedly, the brutal violence came from the right. I have no doubt about that in my mind. But I would just say that Chile remains a country where people have very different opinions about what happened. I run a study abroad program, and my students live with Chilean families, and I ask them, I say, I want you to go home. I give them assignments. I'm like, I want you to go home tonight and ask your parents, your host parents, where they were on September 11th, 1973. And you can imagine the discussion that ensues. They come back and they're like, Professor, oh my God, my parents are Pinochetistas. I mean, I'm living with Pinochetistas. And I'm like, they're out there, right? They're still out there and they're coming back. So my response is it's a society that has very different visions of history. And I understand what you're saying. The young people should not trust the center, because during the years of the Concertación, even though there was this veneer of success, the center failed to address Chile's problems because of the model of democracy. And that's a whole other can of worms about, and I've written on that as well too, why this model failed to be able to initiate enough reforms to satisfy people across the political spectrum. And the other theme is, and I see this happening right now with the Constitutional Council, when the right is threatened, it always wins in Chile, right? And I think that's happening right now. And the only way to stop that dynamic is to engage in reforms that are acceptable to people across the political spectrum, like the Estado de Compromiso that existed in Chile during so many years before the military coup. But I think that's a much deeper question about the failure of political elites in Chile. And I think that's where this rejection comes from, right? And the rejection of the center, because the center didn't do what it needed to do.
Yeah, quick footnote. Chile, like so many other countries also in Latin America, is going through a period where we're talking about the violence of organized crime. And this, you know, this plays right into the playbook of the right, obviously, because that's why most of the surveys suggest that the constitutional reforms did not go through because, you know, the right was really pulling on this. And the organized crime is an international phenomenon as well. And it's, probably the worst elements in Chile are not Venezuelan migrants, as a lot of people say, or even Haitian migrants. It's Brazilian organized crime, according to some of colleagues of mine who are real experts. And so you play that card, and it goes right into the right as well. So let's be wary of that as a phenomena of our current age. And, you know, you don't want too many Dukeles showing up.